It was an autumn night, and the train station was in darkness under the starry sky. The few passengers waiting on the platform looked nervously at their watches, eager for the night train to arrive. After all, it was unusual for a train to leave so late, but this was the only option for those who had urgent matters to attend to. Among the passengers was a man named David. He was tall, dark-haired, and deep-eyed, and carried with him an aura of restlessness. David had a special reason for boarding that night train. He was going to visit his sister, Emily, who lived in a distant city. Emily was ill and had asked to see him one last time. David had a dark feeling that was tormenting him. He felt like something was wrong, like he was walking towards an invisible trap. But he could not ignore his sick sister's desire, and his duty as a brother compelled him to embark on this journey. The train, known as the Midnight Express, finally arrived at the station with a screeching sound of brakes and hiss of steam. David climbed aboard and found his seat in a nearly empty carriage. There were only 2 other passengers in the carriage, an elderly couple, apparently asleep in their seats. As the train began to move, David looked out the window and saw the station disappearing into the distance. A chill ran down his spine as he walked away from the familiar city towards unknown lands. The atmosphere in the carriage was heavy, as if a shadow hung over everyone present. David looked down the hall and saw the train conductor, a middle-aged man with a tired and worried look. He seemed tense, as if he was aware of something the passengers were unaware of. The train was speeding through the night, and David was trying to read a book to distract his restless mind. But his attention was constantly diverted to the strange sounds coming from the corridors. Shuffling footsteps and indistinct murmurs echoed, causing goosebumps to run through his body. David decided to get up and walk around the carriage in hopes of dispelling his anxiety. When he reached the corridor, he saw a shadowy figure standing before the door that led to the next carriage. He was a tall man with his back to David, wearing an overcoat that looked old-fashioned. "Sorry, you're blocking the way," David said in a shaky voice. The tall man didn't move. Instead, he remained motionless, like a statue. David began to feel a chill of fear running through his veins. He reached out to touch the man's shoulder, but when his fingers reached it, the figure dissolved into a cloud of shadows, disappearing before his eyes. Shocked and confused, David backed away and returned to his seat. He tried to convince himself that he was imagining things, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't leave him. He observed the other passengers, but the elderly couple seemed to be sound asleep, oblivious to any disturbance. The train continued to move forward into the night, and David couldn't escape the feeling that something very strange was happening aboard the Midnight Express. His instincts warned him that a journey full of mysteries and dangers was just beginning. The night train continued its mysterious journey, advancing through the darkness of the night. David sat in his seat, looking out the window with a sense of uneasiness that wouldn't leave him. The shadowy figure he had seen in the hallway still haunted his thoughts. The strange murmurs and sounds persisted, becoming more audible as the train moved through the desolate landscape. David wasn't the only worried passenger. The other passengers seemed equally disturbed. The elderly couple had woken up and were now nervously looking around. At one point, David decided to explore the train to try to understand what was happening. He got up, headed down the hall, and started walking toward the next car. As he walked away, the darkness seemed to swallow the carriage he was in, making the journey even more surreal. When he entered the next carriage, he was met with an even stranger sight. The lights were dim, and the atmosphere was thick like fog. The passengers in this carriage seemed listless, staring blankly into space with glassy eyes. David approached a woman who was sitting alone, absorbed in her thoughts. He gently touched her shoulder, but she didn't react. Her eyes were empty, as if her soul had been ripped out. "What's going on here?" David whispered to himself, trying to understand what was going on. At this moment, a voice echoed in his mind. It was the voice of the shadowy figure he had seen earlier. "Welcome to the Shadow Realm, David. You will not escape easily." David turned around but saw no one. The voice! It seemed to come from everywhere at once. He began to feel an overwhelming pressure in his mind, as if something was trying to invade him. Desperate, he ran back to his carriage, where he found the other passengers equally apathetic, as if in a trance. He tried to wake them up, but it was as if they were in a deep sleep from which they could not be awakened. Determined to discover the truth, David continued his journey on the train, going from car to car. With each step, the darkness seemed to intensify, and the whispering voice continued to echo in his mind. Finally, when he reached the last car, he made a horrifying discovery. In the center of the carriage, there was a dark portal that emanated an evil energy. He could feel that he was the source of all the strange happenings on board. Determined to face whatever was on the other side, David took a tentative step toward the portal. He could hear the whispering voice getting louder, resisting his approach. But he couldn't go back. His instinct impelled him to move forward, to unravel the mystery surrounding the Midnight Express, and to rescue the passengers trapped in this nightmare. With his heart pounding, David stepped through the portal, plunging into a realm of darkness and shadows that defied logical explanation. What he would find on the other side was beyond his most terrifying imagination, and his journey was just beginning. As soon as David crossed the dark portal, a feeling of oppression enveloped him like an icy blanket. He found himself in a completely different world from inside the train. It was a place devoid of light, where shadows writhed and moved like living entities. The whispering voice that had haunted him aboard the train was louder than ever, echoing in his mind like an eerie echo. "You have entered my domain, David. There is no escape now." David looked around, trying to discern any sign of life or direction. The darkness was overwhelming, and he felt like he was lost in an endless nightmare. He remembered his sick sister, Emily, and this gave him the strength to carry on. He could not allow terror to overcome him. As he explored the shadow realm, he began to notice indistinct figures moving at the edges of his vision. They were like specters, pale figures that seemed to watch him with empty eyes. As David moved forward, he began to notice the shadows taking shape and beginning to solidify. They turned into living nightmares, manifestations of his deepest fears and past traumas. Horrifying, twisted creatures surrounded him, whispering cruel words to him. "You were never good enough, David. Your sister is suffering because of you. You're destined to be alone in this darkness forever." David fought these mental torments, focusing on the memory of Emily and his love for her. He knew that these creatures were just manifestations of his own fears and insecurities. He refused to be dominated by them. As he advanced through the shadow realm, he began to notice small gaps in the darkness. Small cracks of light began to seep in, as if the darkness was slowly receding. David realized that his memories of love and hope were dispelling the shadows around him. He remembered the happy times with Emily, their laughter and shared stories. As memories of him gained strength, the shadow creatures retreated and finally dissolved into dark mist. David continued his journey, guided by memories of love and connection. The whispering voice grew weaker and weaker, unable to compete with the inner light he had rekindled. Finally, he reached a point where the darkness completely receded, revealing a portal similar to the one that had brought him to this sinister world. David hesitated for a moment, but he knew he couldn't turn back until he solved the riddle of the shadows. With determination, he walked through the portal, leaving the realm of shadows behind and returning to the interior of the train. He was exhausted, but his resolve was stronger than ever. He was determined to discover the truth behind the Midnight Express and save the passengers trapped in this nightmare. As the train continued to move through the night, David was determined to face whatever was waiting for him. He knew the answer was closer than ever, and he would not rest until the mystery was solved and everyone was safe from the terrible riddle of the shadows. Back inside the train, David was determined to find answers to the riddles that had haunted him since the beginning of his journey. The whispering voice that had tormented him was quieter now, as if he too was searching for answers. He returned to the carriage where he had seen for the first time the shadowy figure that had led him to this nightmare. The elderly couple was still there, but they were awake and alert, unlike the other passengers who were in a daze. "What's going on?" David asked, looking at the couple with inquisitive eyes. The elderly woman, whose eyes seemed to have seen many stories, replied in a trembling voice, "This train, the Midnight Express, is a ticket to a world between worlds, a place where the fears and shadows of our minds come to life." Her husband, with a worried look, continued, "We all embarked on this journey for our own reasons, and our fears brought us here. But you, David, are different. Your journey is to save your sister, Emily. David nodded understandingly. He now understood that the train was a kind of prison for the fears and traumas of its passengers, a place where these shadows could manifest and torment their minds. How can we get out of here? Asked David, determined to find a solution. The elderly woman explained, the only way to escape this nightmare is to confront your fears and overcome them. You've already begun to do this, David, by facing the shadow creatures and rekindling the light within yourself. The elderly man added, now you must find the shadowy figure who brought you to this place and discover the truth behind her appearance. She is the key to your liberation. Determined to follow the couple's guidance, David embarked on his final quest. He ventured through the train's corridors, getting closer and closer to encountering the shadowy figure that had been the catalyst for his terrifying journey. Finally, he found her standing before a door, the same door he had first seen at the beginning of his journey. The shadowy figure had its back to him, shrouded in shadow, but David didn't back away. He boldly approached and confronted her. "Who are you?" David asked, his voice firm. The shadowy figure slowly turned around, revealing a pale face and empty eyes. She whispered, "I am your deepest fear, David. I am the manifestation of your own torments and doubts." David looked into the shadowy figure's empty eyes and compassionately said, "You are not real. You are just a shadow, a creation of my own fears. I am no longer afraid of you." As David spoke these words, the shadowy figure began to fade away, transforming into a cloud of shadows that dissipated into the air. The train began to shake violently, as if reacting to the shadowy figure's departure. When the train finally calmed down, David knew something had changed. He returned to the carriage where the other passengers were, and to his surprise, they were awake and free from their hypnotic trance. The elderly couple smiled at him, knowing that he had triumphed over their fears and freed them from the nightmare. David realized that his journey had come to an end, and he was about to meet his sister, Emily. The train finally reached its destination, and David disembarked with a feeling of accomplishment and relief. He knew that darkness still existed within all of us, but he also knew that the light of love and hope was more powerful than any shadow. As he walked toward the city, David knew that his journey had changed his life forever. He had faced his deepest fears and emerged stronger and braver than ever. And most of all, he knew that love for his sister had guided him through the nightmare and brought him back to the light.